Welcome to the deep dive. We're skipping the usual long intros today because we have something really fascinating to get into.
We really do.
Yeah, so imagine taking a single, perfectly healthy branch of a plant, right, and chopping it into like 10 microscopic pieces.
Which sounds like a terrible idea.
Right. It sounds like you're just killing it. But instead, you've actually just engineered this massive increase in your garden's overall yield.
Exactly.
You haven't bought more land, you haven't bought more plants, but you've completely hacked the biological limits of plant cloning.
It's essentially working smarter, not harder, but applied to cellular biology.
Yeah, and that is exactly the mission for today's deep dive. We are analyzing this really tactical set of propagation notes that focuses entirely on the mechanics of plant growth.
Right. It's all about how to maximize those yields, adapt standard techniques to, highly specific plant anatomies, and basically manipulate the environment.
To force life where it mathematically shouldn't exist.
Exactly. It's a masterclass in biological efficiency, really. The source material we're looking at today, it doesn't rely on massive commercial infrastructure or industrial agriculture.
No giant greenhouses required.
Right. It focuses on a really deeply observant, tactical approach to multiplying plants. It's about looking at a biological system, understanding the absolute minimum requirements for cellular reproduction, and then, exploiting those requirements.
Exploit is a good word for it. And the specific case study the notes use for this, our test subject for today, is a plant called the Globe Amaranth.
Right, Gomphrena globosa.
Yeah, Gomphrena globosa,
Mm.
which, if you've seen it, it's known for these incredibly vibrant, sort of clover-like flower heads. But we aren't actually looking at the flowers today.
No, we're looking at the raw foundational shift in how these notes suggest propagating them.
Because normally, if you want to clone a plant, let's say standard pothos vine or something, you take a long piece of the stem. You want a cutting with like 3, 4, maybe 5 nodes on it.
Right, that's the traditional multi-node strategy. You bury a few of those nodes in the soil to act as an anchor, to grow roots.
And then you leave a few above the surface for the leaves.
Exactly. It provides this massive biological buffer for the plant. But the source material documents a deliberate, really hard pivot away from that safety net.
They just abandon it.
Completely abandon it. They shift exclusively to a high-volume single-node strategy.
Which means isolating just that one single dense cellular hub, right, where the leaves and the roots naturally diverge.
Just that one tiny intersection.
But, okay, let's unpack this for a second, because it makes sense in theory, right? Like slicing a propagation pie into thinner pieces, you get more chances to win the lottery with the same amount of stem.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
But practically, you are leaving a microscopic stick with maybe one leaf attached. Without a long stem to store carbohydrates, how does it even have the energy to heal the physical wound you just inflicted?
Let alone build an entirely new root system.
Right, before it just starves to death. Does this magical single-node trick actually work for every plant?
Well, to answer the first part, that is the exact metabolic gamble the source is taking, and it requires a really deep understanding of cellular biology. When you sever a stem, you are cutting off the plant's nutrient and water highway.
It's completely disconnected.
Right. A multi-node cutting, because it has that thick, long stem filled with stored starches, it basically brings its own packed lunch to survive the rooting process.
Okay, I like that. A packed lunch.
But a single-node cutting has almost zero stored energy.
Nothing.
Right. However, that single node contains meristematic tissue.
Plant stem cells.
Basically, yes. They are undifferentiated cells that can rapidly become whatever the plant needs to survive. So the logic in the notes is that by isolating the node, you force the plant to immediately direct 100% of its available, albeit limited, energy into root production.
Instead of wasting energy trying to keep a massive length of unnecessary stem alive.
Exactly. You are inducing a state of absolute biological panic to force a specialized response.
Wow. Okay, so panic as a growth strategy.
Yeah.
But looking at the numbers in the source, the real benefit isn't just speed or efficiency, it's the math of the yield.
The pure volume.
Yeah. If I have a branch with 10 nodes, the traditional multi-node method gives me, maybe 2 or 3 cuttings total?
Usually, yes.
But the single-node method gives me 10 separate chances at life.
It is entirely a numbers game. Even if the individual survival rate of a fragile single-node cutting is lower than a robust multi-node cutting, the sheer volume of attempts mathematically guarantees a higher total yield.
You're just maximizing the output of whatever source material you have.
Precisely. But to your earlier question, no, this does not work for everything. You can't just go out and chop an oak tree or rose bush into tiny little single-node confetti.
I just expect a forest to pop up.
Right. And the notes are very clear on that caveat. This is highly species dependent. Many woody plants, or species with different vascular structures, they absolutely require the carbohydrate reserves of a long stem.
They just can't handle a panic.
Exactly. They lack the aggressive meristematic response to survive, being reduced to a single node. So the methodology requires you to know the physiological limits of your specific subject.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual field test in the notes, because they applied this single node strategy to a batch of those Globe Amaranth stems.
Right, the Gomphrena.
Yeah. And when you look at the raw data from that initial test, I mean, out of about 10 single node cuttings, exactly 3 sprouted.
3 out of 10.
3. The notes document that you could literally see new leaves pushing directly out of those isolated nodes. But here's where it gets really interesting to me, and I want to push back a little.
Okay, go ahead.
3 out of 10 is a 30% success rate. That germination rate sounds, well, a bit low. I mean, in almost any other system, if 7 out of 10 units fail, the system is fundamentally broken. Why is our source so confident this is a success?
What's fascinating here is that it requires a massive shift in how you define a successful experiment.
How so?
When you're testing a radical new protocol like this, a 30% success rate is not a failure, it's a baseline.
A baseline, okay.
The author of the notes, they aren't mourning the 7 cuttings that desiccated and died. They are hyper-focused on the 3 that survived, because those 3 validate the core hypothesis.
That the biological mechanism actually functions.
Exactly. Globe Amaranth theoretically can propagate from a single node. The biological barrier of is this impossible has been clear. The plant has the cellular capacity to do it.
Okay, I see. So once you establish that the biology works, the remaining 70% failure rate isn't a problem with the plant itself.
No, it's a problem with the process. And the notes show incredible confidence in improving that rate simply by dialing in the environmental variables.
Right, optimizing the room. And the most critical variable when you sever a plant from its root system is moisture.
Absolutely.
Because a cutting is essentially bleeding out,
Yeah.
right? It's like a hydraulic system that just lost its main pump.
That is the perfect way to look at it. A plant moves water through transpiration, it pulls moisture up from the roots, and releases it as vapor through tiny pores in the leaves.
The stomata, right?
Yes, the stomata. So when you take a cutting, you break the vacuum. The roots are gone, but the leaves don't immediately know that.
They just keep sweating.
They keep their stomata open, continuing to release water vapor into the air, and if the cutting transpires all its internal moisture before it can grow new roots to drink, the cells collapse and it dies.
So to stop that hydraulic failure, the source brings up a really common propagation trick, which is you take your shears and you literally cut the remaining leaves on the cutting completely in half.
It is a violent intervention,
Very violent.
but biologically necessary for most plants. By slicing the leaf in half, you are immediately removing 50% of the surface area.
Which means 50% of the stomata are gone.
Right. You instantly cut the plant's moisture loss in half, allowing it to retain hydration while it builds a new root system.
Oof. And this is the fascinating detail. Looking closely at the methodology applied to the Globe Amaranth, they specifically chose not to do this.
They left the leaves completely intact.
Yeah. And the reason why really highlights the danger of, like, blindly following a textbook over just observing reality.
The exception to the rule. The author notes that the leaves of the Globe Amaranth are incredibly delicate. They're tiny and they're very pointy.
Right. If you try to take a pair of scissors to a leaf that small, you aren't just reducing surface area. You're probably crushing the vascular tissue of the node itself.
The physical trauma of the cut would cause way more biological damage than the moisture loss.
It's just too much trauma.
Exactly. It demonstrates a really high level of situational awareness. A novice follows the manual, right? Always cut leaves to save moisture.
But an expert analyzes the actual anatomy of the subject in front of them.
Yes, and realizes that the generalized rule will cause a catastrophic failure in this specific instance.
Okay, so we're stuck in this biological catch-22 then.
Yeah.
We know from the 30% baseline that we are losing cuttings to desiccation.
Right.
We know we can't cut the leaves to save moisture because the anatomy is too delicate. But if we leave them intact, the plant transpires its water supply away.
It's a tricky spot.
So, if the plant can't physically protect itself through modification, the only variable left to manipulate is the room it's sitting in.
Exactly. If the biological subject cannot adapt, the environment must carry the burden. And this is where the notes transition into what we can call the 4 pillars of environmental propagation.
Okay, the 4 pillars. Let's get into this because this is how we boost that 30% success rate.
Right. The source outlines an exact recipe, a set of conditions designed to keep a delicate, fully leafed, single-node cutting alive.
So let's break down the causality of these 4 pillars, because the first one listed is indirect light.
Indirect, yes.
Why indirect? I mean, plants eat light. If it's starving and trying to build roots, wouldn't you want to give it maximum solar radiation to power that cellular growth?
It actually comes back to the hydraulic failure we just discussed. Direct sunlight carries a massive thermal load.
It gets hot.
It gets very hot. When a fully rooted plant gets hot in the sun, it cools itself down by pulling up groundwater and transpiring it.
To sweating.
Sweating, exactly. But a rootless cutting cannot sweat effectively. If you place a vulnerable single-node cutting in direct sunlight, the thermal energy will literally cook the plant tissue faster than the limited moisture can cool it.
Oh, wow. So it just bakes.
Right. It needs the photons from light to fuel the meristematic cellular division, but it absolutely requires gentle, filtered light that doesn't bring excessive heat.
Okay, that makes sense. And that leads perfectly into the second pillar, high humidity.
Right.
Because if the plant is stuck with all its leaves open, releasing water vapor, we have to change the air around it.
It relies on the physics of vapor pressure. If you place a cutting in dry air, the moisture inside the wet leaf is aggressively pulled out into the dry room.
Like a sponge.
Exactly. But if you saturate the air surrounding the cutting with water vapor, creating high humidity, you reduce the vapor pressure deficit. The air is already full of water, so it cannot absorb much more from the plant.
So the moisture stays locked inside the leaf tissue where it is desperately needed.
Precisely.
But that creates a massive secondary problem, which is why the third pillar in the notes is good ventilation.
Yes. Crucial.
Because if you trap a plant in 95% humidity with no airflow, you aren't just growing roots. It's like leaving a damp towel shoved in the bottom of a gym bag.
The damp gym bag is an incredibly accurate metaphor.
Right. The humidity keeps the towel wet, which is what we want for the plant. But without fresh oxygen flushing through, you are building a 5-star resort for fungal spores.
Yeah, the exact environmental conditions that encourage a vulnerable cutting to stay hydrated, high moisture and warmth, are the exact same conditions required for pathogenic fungi and rot to thrive.
It's a fine line.
Very fine. Stagnant wet air allows spores to settle on the damaged tissue of the cut stem and just multiply. You must introduce a gentle airflow to disrupt the settling of pathogens.
And provide fresh carbon dioxide, I assume.
Exactly, all without blowing away the humidity blanket you just created. It is an incredibly delicate balancing act.
Okay, so we have filtered light to prevent thermal shock, high humidity to trap moisture in the leaves, and ventilation to fight off the fungal spores. What is the fourth pillar the notes rely on?
The fourth is the physical addition of a rooting hormone to the severed stem.
A rooting hormone, is that like just a highly concentrated fertilizer to feed the plant?
Not at all. It doesn't feed the plant. It gives it instructions.
Instruction?
Yeah. A rooting hormone introduces synthetic auxins to the cut wound. In a healthy plant, auxins are hormones naturally produced at the top of the plant that travel downward with gravity.
Okay.
And they signal the base of the plant to push out roots. But when you take a tiny single node cutting, you remove that downward signaling system.
Oh, you've chopped that off.
Right. So by physically dipping the severed base into a synthetic auxin compound, you are artificially mimicking that chemical gravity signal.
You are hacking the plant's internal communication network.
Exactly. You are forcing the undifferentiated cells at the node to rewrite their internal DNA instructions, commanding them to stop behaving like stem tissue and immediately begin structuring root tissue.
That is wild. But okay, looking at these 4 pillars holistically, building a space that perfectly balances gentle filtered light, near total humidity, constant pathogen clearing airflow, and chemical optimization. It sounds like you need like $1 million climate-controlled commercial greenhouse.
And that is the brilliance of the alternative solution provided in the source.
Because I don't have the space or budget for a greenhouse.
Most people don't. The author completely sidesteps the need for massive infrastructure. Instead, the notes detail a plan utilizing simple wire racks equipped with plastic humidity domes.
Just like a standard shelving rack and a clear plastic lid over a tray of dirt.
Exactly. The source refers to these setups as a fantastic alternative to a full-size greenhouse.
Really? Just a lid?
It's just a lid. The clear plastic dome traps the moisture evaporating from the soil, instantly creating that high humidity microenvironment we talked about.
Vapor pressure.
Right. And most of these domes feature adjustable vents on the top, allowing you to dial in that crucial ventilation to keep the air from turning into your damp gym bag scenario.
Okay, but the plastic dome only solves for humidity and airflow. It doesn't solve for the thermal load of the light or the ambient temperature of the room. You can still cook the plant inside a plastic box.
Which is why the final and perhaps most important piece of the methodology relies entirely on passive environmental observation.
Strategic placement.
Exactly. Success isn't achieved by just buying a rack and a dome. The source emphasizes heavily observing the existing environment of the garden to identify the perfect physical locations to place these racks.
You're hunting for microclimates.
You are letting the natural thermal mass of the world do the heavy lifting. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you might place a rack on the eastern side of a brick wall where it receives gentle, cool morning sun, but is completely shielded from the scorching afternoon heat.
Or maybe, like beneath the dappled canopy of a mature shade tree that naturally filters the light.
Exactly. The author indicates they have spent significant time mapping their garden to identify these highly specific zones where the rack and dome setups will naturally sit in the sweet spot of all four pillars.
That is, you are taking the massive capital-intensive concept of a climate-controlled greenhouse and scaling it down into a hyper-efficient plastic dome.
Right.
And then, instead of spending money on electricity to control the temperature and light inside that dome, you're just using the natural shade and thermal properties of your backyard to passively regulate it.
It perfectly encapsulates the hacker mindset in gardening. You don't overpower the problem with brute force or expensive technology. You deeply understand the underlying biological mechanisms, and you manipulate the existing variables to work in your favor.
Yeah, when you look back at the entire process outlined in these notes, it completely redefines what it means to be efficient. We started with the radical math of the single node cutting, abandoning the safety of the multi-node stem to force an aggressive cellular response.
Multiplying the yield by a factor of 10.
Right. And then adapting standard practices, like realizing we couldn't use the leaf cutting trick because we had to accommodate the tiny pointy leaves of the Globe Amaranth.
We recognize that true optimization starts with accepting a 30% baseline survival rate as a definitive biological proof of concept rather than a failure.
Which is huge. And finally, replacing a giant greenhouse with strategically placed humidity domes on racks.
Microclimates.
Yeah. So for you listening, when you're testing a new system in your own life, whatever field that might be, a 30% success rate usually feels devastating. But what this propagation data proves is that 30% isn't a failure. It's just the baseline.
True expertise isn't about having the biggest setup.
No, the core mechanics work. Once you know the biology functions, you don't throw the system away. You simply start observing. You scale down those massive concepts into workable solutions, and you optimize the variables in the room. You find your microclimates.
It requires a profound level of fearless iteration. You have to be willing to push the system to its absolute limits just to see what survives.
Speaking of pushing things to their absolute limits, we spent a lot of time today discussing the standard propagation technique of slicing a living leaf completely in half just to reduce its surface area.
It's a fascinating biological paradox, really.
It is. You are committing this violent, traumatic physical intervention that destroys half of the plant's solar panels, all to prevent it from bleeding out its own water supply.
It is an extreme physical modification required to cheat death.
Exactly.
And it leaves me with a thought I can't quite shake, actually. We learned that slicing a leaf in half is a standard trick to stop a rootless cutting from losing moisture. We've seen how a severed stem can rewrite its own cellular instructions to survive having its leaves mutilated.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, across the broader spectrum of biology, what other extreme, seemingly catastrophic physical modifications can a living organism not only survive, but actually rely on to cheat death while it grows a whole new foundation?